Two. God, he continues to send his regrets. All right. So it's a pretty light crowd, but I guess folks are still recovering from their hangovers. So we wanted to just recap day one, give you a sense of what we talked about, both on the ops track as well as on the philosophy track, mostly for those who missed one or the other. But we also wanted to give you a preview of what's going to be unfolding for day two for the philosophy track. I think for the ops track, you already have, actually, you get the slides on the other side. But anyway, for the ops track, you already have the agenda somewhere, which I can't find. Whatever. Okay, anyway, I'll let you figure it out.
Linux is hard.
Yeah. All right. We'll have the ops track, the agenda. I don't think that's changed much, but we're going to add a bunch of turbo talks. Day one. So here's the ops track agenda, which if you don't already have. Oh, that's right.
That's right.
Yeah. And we're going to go through that. But I wanted to recap day one. And so I'll just start with day one for philosophy track, and then I'll turn it over to my buddy Ryan to cover day one for ops track for those who missed it on the philosophy side. So I'm going to switch back. All right. Yeah. Okay. So on day one for philosophy track, we covered a number of different topics, and ultimately what we're trying to do is to consolidate these into major themes. Because ultimately what we want to do is take these themes and build out frameworks, build out models, build out reusable content that we can all point to and further our practice on. So in the morning, Josh talked about deception, actually, and how do we use deception to gain home field advantage. And so that was a topic that will probably resonate again with Gotti. We'll talk about that in a moment as we talk about the key themes that emerged. Then Andrea talked about increasing the retention capacity in our field. That was actually a pretty interesting study that she did to understand what keeps people in their jobs. What are things that we can do to incentivize folks to remain in their security jobs that they have today? And it actually will dovetail into a conversation that we'll talk about as it relates to what does it mean to professionalize our practice? And that's another key theme that emerged. Thomas, who talked at 10:50, actually hit upon that topic quite a bit. And there was a number of analogies that emerged around what does the medical profession look like? What does the legal profession look like? And if these are truly professions, what are the analogies? What are the analogs? What are the sacrifices that we need to make in our practice to turn it into a profession as well? Toby beforehand talked about red teaming and a lot of really good takeaways from that in terms of what are good red teaming best practices. Megan in the afternoon hit strengthen your security ops team by leveraging neurodiversity. This was actually one of my favorites. It was a surprise in terms of revealing how do you work with high-functioning Asperger's or high-functioning autism folks who can bring a lot to bear with their intense focus, attention to detail, and a single-minded focus on completing a particular task to do a lot of the things that we need to have done in the security field. That was a fabulous talk. I would certainly recommend that you guys take a look at that when you get a chance as well. And then Erin talked about a tool that that DHS is pulling out around how do you make better ethics decisions. And she pointed out a tool called CREDS, C-R-E-D-S, that's worth taking a look at to understand what's the decision framework for ethical decisions. Later on in the afternoon, Joe Slowick talked about the evaluation and assessment of security tool effectiveness. So this was another theme that emerged around how do you evaluate different tools? How do you make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do? Later today, we're going to also have a talk from the MITRE folks on a similar topic, and we're going to deep dive into that theme later today as well. Kelly Shortridge discussed the comparison between hazard assessment versus attack prediction and why we should really focus on hazard assessment versus attack prediction, because ultimately you can do something about hazard assessment, but attack prediction, sometimes you may not necessarily have the right tools or capabilities to address that. Jerry talked about the contrarian CISO, and he was very deliberate in throwing out very inflammatory ideas, ones that are thought-provoking and are worth considering in terms of really turning our typical assumptions on its head. And it's worth taking a look at and just reevaluating, are we doing the right things within security for the right reasons? Are we doing it just because it's routine and because some checklist tells us to do it? Or are we doing it in the right way with the right intention? And his talk was a really good talk on that front. And then we had Guillaume leverage some work that we did last year. So I presented on the cyber defense matrix last year. Guillaume actually took one of the things that I said we need further work on, and he actually did further work on it and presented on that particular topic. I want to highlight that just briefly to say that's kind of what we're trying to do here in this conference. We want people to present their work, and then we as a group want to further that work. And so today, in the philosophy track, that is actually the intention. A lot of the topics that we talked about yesterday, we're going to try to further that work and provide content and materials that we can go home with as well. And then lastly, actually not lastly, Janusz talked about attribution and what are some of the ways that we can, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for doing attribution analysis within our field. And lastly, although you can't see it on the very bottom, Paul Vixie gave a really great talk about what are some real thorny challenges that we have in our space as we continue to persist in creating bugs in our software, in our processes, and all the things that we do, that we build today. There are going to be bugs that are going to persist forever, and how do we tackle what is going to be a really hard, what continues to be a really hard challenge going forward? So out of those different topics, we ended up with 3, maybe 4 major themes. So one was professionalizing our workforce. What does that look like? What's the right framework for defining that? The second one was around the tools effectiveness, testing and evaluation, a testing and an evaluation framework. So those are those two topics were the most heavily talked about. And so we're going to dedicate this afternoon within the philosophy track to cover those 2 topics in greater detail, whereupon we will try to draw in you guys to really think about what does that framework look like, how do we add to it, what are the criteria that we should consider, and so on and so forth. Okay. So anyway, we also have a couple turbo talks that are going to come up. You'll see that in the agenda that I pushed out earlier today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan as he tries to get his computer, his Linux machine up and running.
The problem is that I deleted my slide through my screen.
Oh, let's see. Oh, I see. Yes.
One second.
Any questions while Ryan is trying to figure out his own computer? None?
None. I guess you covered it really well.
Yeah.
A little dead air. I want to thank Intel for giving us some donuts.
Okay. Thank you, Intel. Steve, I guess. Steve Warren, thank you for sponsoring. Who's sponsoring for lunch?
I think you know who that is.
Is that me?
Reversing Labs gave us
Oh.
lunch, and then we have 2 other people who give us lunches.
Okay. Well, do you know who's sponsoring lunch today? I forget who is. It's either me or somebody else.
You or Mike.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's either Sunil for lunch or Mike who's not here for lunch.
So I hope the food's good.
It will be.
Absolutely. Hi. So Sunil told me about 10 seconds ago that we were doing this. So basically, the overarching theme of our track on operations is less about thinking the strategic, huge point of view of how do we push everything forward all the time for the next 25 years, and more about stuff's broke right now. And we're all sitting in the firefight together trying to figure out, like, how do I not only handle my problems today, but do it in a way which makes doing it tomorrow easier, right? I'm not just using a bucket and throwing the water out of the ship. I'm actually trying to repair the ship so that we can start sailing in the right direction full time, and I can go work on something that's a little more interesting maybe, or a much harder problem to solve. And so that is basically the ongoing theme of our track all 3 days. Yesterday's, I would say, soft themes were probably maybe a little more machine learning and AI, and starting to talk about statistics and how we can apply that to our field. And then we had some very, very good, I would say, if you have access to GitHub and you're happy with pulling out a hammer and banging out some code, we had some very good shares. So we can go down the list really quickly. Just starting with Nate Warfield's awesome presentation. I don't know if anyone else smiles as much as I do when someone starts to go, so I was looking at our own resources and I was deciding, hey, there's a huge vulnerability out here. How can I apply that knowledge and figure out who's vulnerable? And how can I protect my customers and do my job? And Nate's got I would say, probably one of the largest customer bases in the world, and he's probably one of the most capable people at doing it. And so by going through Azure and trying to suss out, hey, this vulnerability seriously cracked people for millions of dollars last year. How can we go through and protect that? And he had a really good presentation on, functionally identifying those people and working with customers, and how Microsoft quite often behind the scenes is trying to do that on most of our behalfs. I found that a really cool presentation. Daniel Schwalbe, if you guys are familiar with Farsight, they have an immense amount of resources, especially when it comes to DNS and newly observed domains, and they're sitting in the flow of a lot of different organizations. Mine's one of them. So he did a pretty good presentation on, what is the fallout when we start to look at the news and we start to see, like, how are people taking advantage of our customers? How are people taking advantage of our friends? Is there a way that we can take this, like, how many people here are sitting on big data? You have work, you have this huge petabyte cluster, right? And it's full of garbage half the time because, programmers have to load data too. And, so you're sitting there going, how can I use this? How can I think about it in unique and interesting ways? And Daniel highlighted one of those, which is, let's just look at, crazy idea. I'm going to go see there's a tragedy. How can I expand upon that? How can I find people who are suffering from that tragedy and use my resources to alleviate it? After that, Joseph Zadeh basically did a huge, instead of sitting there and staring at your own internal stuff, because a lot of us I'm going to go ahead and use the word cloud averse. I think probably about half the room is cloud averse, and the other half is why aren't you using the cloud for everything? And Joseph did a really good job of trying to bridge that gap to where you start to go, hey, let's get outside the data you're comfortable with. Let's study some of the security angles that maybe you're not the most familiar with, and look at the stuff that can fall right out, and go after it, and don't be afraid, and look at all the resources. He had a couple slides where it's like, look at all the resources that are available to you if you really want to get into that space and really start to dig in. And then, of course, my friend Justin Borland, so bias alert. I have to say that was my favorite talk yesterday, just because I work with him, and if I don't say that, he'll come beat me up. So, but all kidding aside, I'm a strong believer that Cuckoo is awesome. I'm also a strong believer that Cuckoo is one of the most biggest pains in the ass to install of any open source system that's that valuable. And so by them really trying to smooth that angle, I think he used the term easy button, him and Greg, which is pretty awesome. I wanted to interrupt their talk and say, how many people here have an installed Cuckoo right now that is not being used because you just don't have time to keep the VMs up to date, and you just don't have time to get the infrastructure working correctly? I'm one of those people, and now I use his system full time. So I'm really excited to see where that project's going to go. If you are someone who is familiar with things like GoBash, or just a really good Cuckoo hacker, just please pull their please pull their code and start helping out, because I think that's really going to be the next step in moving us into an automated format where we're all sort of sharing the resources. And while a lot of our employers go, we can't be uploading files to Ryan's work, that seems like a really bad breach of trust. What we can do is be operating on the same platform, and that means we can share the same interfaces and same language. And then after that, Rick and Laura, the starting problem was one of the most interesting and surprising talks we had yesterday. So if anyone's familiar with Rick's work, I've seen nothing but the output for the past 2 years, where he's constantly going, look at my YARA rules, and if you read them, it's sort of like they were written by some mix of John Nash and Memento. And so you're just like, where did this come from, and what is the basis for this? And he has like thousands of them, so there's got to be something that's doing it. And so what the missing gap, I think, for a lot of us who've read his work for a while is, I've never seen the videos, I've never seen the pictures, I've never seen he talks about on his website, nature created these algorithms. And so for a while I was like, well, he is selling stuff, so I guess we give him a pass on that because it is kind of grandiose. But you start to stare at the methodology he used, especially in his talk yesterday, about how what they're doing to really boil down what JavaScript looks like in terms of his image-based format, and then how he wraps that format around a filter to where he can kind of universally apply it. I was blown away. I've had some criticism for Rick in the past, and a lot of it got answered yesterday. So I feel if you only have 10 minutes, go to the last 10 minutes of that and get blown away. It was very good. And then Jordan Wright, who hopefully he's not here when I say this, is one of my heroes. Him and I do a lot of similar work. His Fish in a Barrel, I know, is the result of not just a lot of love in terms of his spare time, being someone who hunts down bad guys just extemporaneously, but now as a profession. I thought that there were some, beyond the message that he's trying to send in terms of how they work and how they catch fish and how you can catch your own fish and the algorithms that he gave out for free, I felt there was a subtle background message in his presentation, whereas if you look at his presentation compared to a lot of the other presentations we have, especially anything I've written, he did a very good job, but most of his slides only had 3 or 4 words, 2 or 3 pictures. But just by looking at it, I thought, wow, we could synthesize this type of communication to talk to people. Because there was a slide he had where he was talking about how many they send out, how many phishing messages they send out to their potential targets, how many people viewed it, how many people clicked it, and how many people responded. But it was literally 4 graphics and 5 words. But I could have printed that out, taken it to my boss, and been like, hey, we need $150,000 to do this. And he would have said, why? And I could have just shown him that. And he would have been like, okay, here's your check. Obviously depending on where you work, but I thought his communication was extremely on point. Where I'm going to pull that down later and see what I can do to apply that to my own communication. I thought it was a really good presentation. Matt Meisel, I think this is like one. I call this the sleeper session almost, where not in the terms of actually sleeping, but like you looked at the first couple of slides and you thought, all right, we're about to get into some machine learning. And some statistics, and there was a whole lot of equations on those first few slides, and I think a lot of people were like, ooh, what's going on? And then as he got into Rogers, and he started talking about, hey, let's wrap the last 2 months of my life around IPython notebooks, and let's not just let that analysis that I'm doing fall off to the wayside, right? And so I think that presentation did a really good job of saying, yes, there's a lot of math here. And for a lot of people, they kind of went, ooh, there's a lot of math. But I think the end of that presentation, he really went, here's how I can explain that math to people who aren't statistics PhDs and aren't sitting on a biochemistry background. And so if you can download Rogers and start working with it, I think it'll be interesting to see how that comes out. I know that it's very much, I'm going to call it alpha. And I think he would appreciate anyone who can contribute back. But I really believe, if we're talking about pushing forward how we talk to each other, not to our bosses, and definitely not to the news, but how we talk to each other, I think the concept of IPython notebooks is very important to that. I think that if we can start to generate some sort of Git or common sharing interface where I can go, this is how I worked through taking apart this malware, and it has not only the write-up, right, which is pretty and everyone loves, but also has here's the commands I ran, here's the memory I was taking apart, here, you can go take it apart too, you run the same exact command, you'll be able to look at it, oh, you found something similar, and now you can pass it back. I think that's a very important concept, but it's got a lot of infrastructure around it that'll take a while. And then Sam Harwin, I think we could call this the communication that we all don't like to hear, where we are all, I know I'm one of the most guilty people of this, and he will attest to that being a former employer of mine, which is I deliver technology, and I'm super excited about technology, and if I can wrap it in a bash script, and I'm like, look, we can do all this, and it's great, and it shards out, and we're done. And then Sam's talk is about, hey, you're 20% of the way there to getting it actually doing anything. You have a lot of people you need to convince, and here's how you can convince them. And I thought he did a really good job. I think I walked up and told him yesterday, if I could have heard that talk a year ago, it probably would have helped me out quite a bit. I think that's probably one of my biggest areas of weakness. And then Pete and Eric are talking today on the ops track, and I'm super looking forward to this. At a show of hands, who filled out the survey that was sent out? It's okay, don't be ashamed. I filled it out. I filled out paragraphs on it, so I suspect some of my answers will be pretty obvious. And then that was us for the day. Like I said, most of our stuff is very focused on what can I do today. So anyone who's attending the ops track today, I got some after-hours feedback, and you can fully expect that I will probably be a bit more interruptive. I think a lot of people were asking questions going, how can I actually take what you're doing without being a subject matter expert in what you're doing and apply it to my day? So that's going to be a reoccurring question today. So thanks for listening.
Great. That was actually a great summary for very little preparation. So
No preparation.
with no preparation, it was very good. So you guys have the schedule. There's one quick audible that I'd like to do. So Frank and Chris, they're presenting at 3 o'clock on the ops track. But as many of you guys know, in the ops track, it's actually very noisy when folks are talking back there. It's actually quieter in the philosophy track. And so if I may ask your indulgence and have you guys actually go to the philosophy track where it's a little quieter and you can hear people better. The philosophy track also has Frank and Chris. We're going to combine at that particular point because it's a framework idea that we want to specifically collaborate on. But just for that particular session, we'll combine everyone together again. And if we could do it at the philosophy track, that'd be great. It'll make it a little quieter for you guys so you can actually hear the conversation. So with that, anything else? Okay, any questions? Tomatoes? Cabbages? Okay, all right, great. Well, hopefully you enjoy your day. And then, as I mentioned, if you haven't already seen the, yeah.
That's mine, not yours.
That's yours. That's mine, yes. Okay. Yeah, so the philosophy track agenda hadn't been published ahead of time, so I want to make sure folks know what's going on. We're going to have a couple talks this morning, and then we're going to try to figure out how do we actually develop these frameworks, because we need some guidance and guidelines around how we build these frameworks out. The main thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to hinge these frameworks on the talks that were given. So last year, we didn't quite do that, and so there was not really a clear lead who's going to take it forward. This time around, we're actually trying to define very clear leads. Those clear leads, I've already asked most of them that I think most of the folks know who the leads are, but there's a bunch of themes that we are proposing for day 2. Here are some of them. If some of these things are of interest to you, please join the philosophy track, help build out these frameworks so that we can make them reusable and useful in advancing our profession. So, okay, all right, with that, we'll break. We'll start the philosophy track in about 5 minutes. Thanks. And same for the ops track. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was really good.